All right, so today I'm going to do something a little bit different. I've been in a ranty, rambly mood lately for the content here at WrestleJuice. So instead of doing something like guessing what the Bash at Berlin card looks like, which I'll probably end up doing next week, or I'll probably give you my early predictions for that, I thought I would do something kind of different. I want to talk about the critique of pro wrestling, the criticism of pro wrestling, and how best to approach it. I'll tell you what I'm talking about. I saw this tweet earlier today from my friends over at Wrestle Talk, and it was just transcribing something Dave Meltzer, of course, probably the guy who his opinion is debated and discussed and is oftentimes controversial because he's been doing it for so long and everybody looks at his star ratings and are like, Dave Meltzer. And somebody's been passing around the Sammy Guevara promo from a Dynamite ages ago where he talks about wanting stars from Dave Meltzer. And so it just got me thinking about this stuff. Anyways, I saw this tweet. And he said, the tweet here says, Dave Meltzer has compared the G1 Climax match between El Phantasmo and AEW's Konosuke Takeshita to WWE SummerSlam in this week's Raw, saying the match has made him realize he overrates WWE, quote, something fierce. He said this, I'll tell you when I watched that match, they're like just on a different level. It was like when I was thinking about how good Monday's Raw was, and it was a good angle show, and some of the matches were good, and some of the matches at SummerSlam were good. Then I watched that match, and it's like, man, I overrate WWE something fierce because compared to this, they're not even in the same thing. These guys were so incredible. Now, I'm happy for Dave Meltzer that he saw a match that at his age, especially after having done this for so long, he still finds matches that he's like, oh my God, this is making me reconceptualize everything that I've done before. This is making me realize that I'm getting wrapped up in the WWE hype train. And I was like, you know what? That's kind of a little bit on, it's interesting. I'll put it that way. Because to me, and granted, I've been doing this silly podcast going in Raw with my best friend Larson for about 10 years now. For me, going back to 1997 when I first started watching wrestling in college, wrestling has always been simply part of wrestling. Pro wrestling is a mishmash of ingredients. Lately, WWE has been firing on all cylinders, most cylinders, a lot of cylinders, telling the stories that they're telling. You can point to a number of feuds, specifically Judgment Day and everything that's going on there. You can point towards CM Punk and Drew McIntyre and Seth Rollins and everything that's going there as angles that are, as feuds, I should say, as stories that are really hot, that really get the crowd going, that get huge reception. Dave Meltzer's talking about a single match here. And it got me thinking, and this is not a criticism of his. It is merely this, the entire thesis of this video is simply trying to find a way to properly critique pro wrestling. That was kind of interesting because there's when you look across the landscape of different media, movies, for example, every outlet, newspaper nowadays, YouTube, a review site, whatever, will usually break down movies with a star system. At least back in the day, that's how it was done. I'm sure a lot of people still do that to this day. Siskel and Ebert had their thumbs up or thumbs down. But even them, I think in their like newspaper reviews, they would give they had like a 4-star rating system, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Certain things it's very easy to rate based off of that type of system, a star rating system. Albums. And yet I don't remember very many individual songs that were rated by stars by a variety of publications. Usually they'll take the entire work of art known as an album and rate it based on some sort of star metric, some sort of metric system, I should say. Dave Meltzer does that for pro wrestling matches. I don't really recall many people doing that for individual television episodes or seasons of TV. That's kind of a different thing. These days, television shows can have the same kind of production value as like big budget movies. And yet it's the movies that still benefit from or receive the benefit of that kind of rating system. I think it's obvious because movies have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They end. It's a whole unit. Things get kind of murky when you get into like the Marvel movies because it's just like a never-ending soap opera. But movies, generally speaking, they are a self-contained thing. And so you can take a look at one self-contained thing that's between an hour and a half and 3 hours long and assign it a rating because you have the entire story there. Pro wrestling functions a lot different. A little different. Number one, any pro wrestling match can be in a vacuum, can be held in a vacuum. Pretty much every indie promotion doesn't really have the benefit of like weekly television, although a lot of them are on YouTube, wrestlers that are signed like exclusively where they can do that stuff. So oftentimes at independent wrestling shows, the matches are just the matches. The wrestlers tell the story that they want to tell within the confines of that match. But usually, generally speaking, there isn't a pre-existing feud. Now, their indie promotions have plenty of pre-existing feuds. But oftentimes, it's like, okay, you're going to have a match. And then they put it together and then they go in there and they hash out what the story is going to be beforehand. And they go into the ring and they tell the story. It's a self-contained thing, right? And so that is relatively easy to star rate. But when Dave Meltzer says, I have been overrating WWE something fierce, I feel like he's probably missing out on some vital elements of those matches. For example, Liv Morgan versus Rhea Ripley is one match out of a larger story. Because in my mind, there's like three things that make up a pro wrestling match. There's the actual match itself, right? That's the actual match, which is usually like the third act of a movie because all the stuff you do building up to that leads to the match, right? So that's like in wrestling, we call it the blow off if that's the final match of a series. But generally speaking, in wrestling, you build a story that leads to one final chunk of story, which is the third act, which is the actual match. That's what Dave Meltzer kind of rates, is that when he talks about WWE. When he talks about WWE, he's talking about usually the third act of a movie. So he's saying how they finish a story, I'm overrating because he doesn't really rate what comes before that, which is understandable because like sometimes it's a very nebulous thing. Where does the story start? We know where it ends. It's when the ref counts 3 or somebody taps out or whatever. We know where it ends. But where do those things begin? Sometimes it's just a promo. This dude comes out, says, I'm the champion. Somebody else comes out and they say, I want to be that too. I want to be champion too. And then you get a couple of weeks of like stuff happening between the people. That's like, the middle act. And then you have the match, which is the third act. This is a very loose analogy. And again, this is just ranting right now. But when you look at a match for the G1 and then you look at a Rhea Ripley versus Liv Morgan, within the context of the story, you're getting Liv Morgan versus Rhea Ripley as part of the story with Konosuke Takeshita and El Phantasmo, unless they had some pre-existing thing that I didn't know about. And granted, the G1 is a story into itself. You're talking about one self-contained act. It's like a one-act play, basically. So how do you settle on a rating system where there is so much variation with how these things are being told? I don't know the answer to that question. When I watched Drew McIntyre versus CM Punk with Seth Rollins as a special guest referee, having watched the rest of the movie that came before, I am now far more invested in the silly bracelet shenanigans that are going on. To me, the bracelet is not just a bracelet. It's so much more, which is informed by everything that happened before. But when you're criticizing that, when you have to say, I give this match X number of stars, and you leave out the context of what came before it, if you focus solely on what is the story that happened during this match, everything else be damned, you're doing pro wrestling as an art form a disservice, in my opinion. So the question there becomes, how do you easily, in a digestible fashion, critique a match that is preceded by story? Sometimes story, in the case of the Bloodline, for example, that goes, or Judgment Day, that goes back years. How do you do it? I don't know. Of course, me and Larson do our star ratings over at the Friendo Club Wrestling channel for all the major premium live events from WWE, pay-per-views from AEW. And we do our best to sort of, or at least I do anyways. I know he does too. But I do my best to take that third act and put it in the proper context with what happened before. My emotions during that match and how that story plays out takes a larger role than what moves were done, what kind of storytelling was going on with the chain wrestling, with the actual story they told using physical moves, as opposed to what was going on in that match, which was a lot of conflict between all three participants in the match, which was informed by what happened before. I've seen, obviously, on YouTube, plenty of people have like top 10 lists or ranking, the best feuds of all time, or ranking the best feuds of 2023 or 2024 or whatever. And that's one way to do it, but that's not like a quantifiable thing beyond the confines of the topics that are discussed in that list. So I don't know. What do you guys think? That's kind of what I'm getting at here. What do you guys think would be a satisfying way to critique pro wrestling in a way that's equally as digestible as star ratings, in a way that you could do it like pay-per-view to pay-per-view or match to match? You take a look at Jimmy Uso versus Jey Uso. The match, not very good. That third act did not stick the landing. It's like a movie that has a really good first and second act, but then that last act was like, oh my God, what was that? So let me know in the comments below. Just wanted to get that off my chest. Thought it was an interesting discussion. Just a bunch of word vomit. Hit that thumbs up if you liked anything I had to say. Hit that subscribe button. We'll see you guys around. Friendo U shirts coming soon.